Hello there, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Diego Fleitas. I'm joining you from the University of Mississippi, and I'm happy to have with me here Professor Dennis Britton. Welcome.
Thank you.
Professor Dennis Britton is an associate professor of English at the University of British Columbia. His research foci include the history of race, critical race theory, Protestant theology, and the history of emotion. Indexed by his book Becoming Christian, Race, Reformation, and Early Modern English Romance, alongside co-curating the special issue of Spencer Studies with Kimberly Ann Coles, titled Spencer and Race. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
All right. And of course, we are here to take some time to think through some early modern literature together, to kind of pick it apart, and also to sort of think about the ways in which we can approach this as teachers, as students, and the ways in which we can continue to revive and critically think through these texts. And so for our time today, you chose Love's Labour's Lost, the romantic comedy by Shakespeare. And so I actually just kind of wanted to start off by thinking, what is Love's Labour's Lost? It is a romantic comedy written between 1594 and 1596, and it shares much of what makes Shakespeare's other romantic comedies so interesting and also provocative. The entire play takes place in the Kingdom of Navarre, nestled in the Pyrenees between France and Spain. And the A-plot features the King of Navarre, who has sort of made this self-styled court of academics. They wish to sequester themselves off for 3 years and study and devote themselves to the arts and philosophy, while also excluding the company of women. This is complicated when the Princess of France and her coterie arrive, and the men find that they are very weak when it comes to romantic temptation. And this leads to a whole series of events. And so I wanted to actually start by asking you, why did you choose this play for our time today?
Yes. I chose this play, so I have taught it before, and I like to usually, put at least one thing on the syllabus, that students have never encountered before. They may have heard of it, but they definitely are unlikely they have read it in high school, or even maybe in another Shakespeare class if they've taken more than one. But I also find this play very interesting because of newer attention to race in the play. I think there has been a sort of question, and we might talk about it later, but there has been a question about, what is Rosaline's skin color? And I think more and more critics and people are saying, wait a minute, we should not assume that she is white and just a brunette in the same way that we no longer assume that the dark lady of Shakespeare's sonnets is a white woman with dark features. So I think it's a sort of interesting play. It's an early play, so it's sort of useful in the classroom to sort of, if we're sort of tracing, maybe comparing early works and late works. Of course, as you sort of said, right, it's a romantic comedy, and you can sort of see that Shakespeare has a set of tricks or concerns that, like, oh, he did it in this early play. We can see how these various tricks or concepts or concerns sort of mutate and are developed or expanded or contracted over time. But yeah, it's also, I think it's a play that also forces students to really pay attention to language in ways that they may not want to, but I think is sort of very fruitful to do early in the term.
Absolutely. And sort of turning on your reflection that it has students very actively think about language, I was really stunned to find out that I believe out of all of the plays, this is the one that has the highest proportion of verse to blank verse or to prose. It's a play that is very actively preoccupied with thinking of poetry, with imagining poetry, with promulgating it. And as you suggested also by pointing to race and kind of the critical history around this play, that also means investigating the poetic representations and kind of ways in which race and racial ideology is coded within. I mean, it's very plainly indexed that this is an issue or a matter of concern by the King of Navarre, who tells Biron, who's fallen madly in love with Rosaline, by heaven, thy love is black as ebony. And his reply, is ebony like her? A word divine. It is a play that does have students, I think, actively consider a whole range of fascinating issues. And it's definitely an interesting staging point for thinking through the other comedies. I thought, oh, this is like Much Ado with sort of the affection between Biron and Rosaline. And oh, you
Yes.
have a play at the end of the play. Um, so I can definitely see why you chose it. It is a very, very compelling work. Out of curiosity, how have students responded to the work?
I guess to be honest, it can be a bit of a tough sell, and I think because a lot is said and very little happens, right? The play is characters just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk, and I think it's and for that reason, if students are sort of looking for plot or they're trying to figure out just a reading for plot, this is not a play that really affords that. That being said, I do think it's a play that there's some definitely racist humor in the play, but and there's some classist humor and there's misogynist humor, right? There's lots of humor that is very problematic and troubling, but the play is also very funny. Like in particularly the dialogue can be very funny. And I think when students hear it, so this is a play in particular that I really recommend students listen to, and one can find various audiobooks, on YouTube. I think the Shakespeare Network has a variety of audiobooks with really good actors. They were produced by the BBC in like the late 90s, I believe. So, so it's, a link that I give to students. And I think this play in particular, right, get your book open, and sort of follow along in your book while you're listening, because some of the jokes and the differences between the characters is it becomes much clearer when we're listening, right? Of course, if you're watching the play on the stage, it would also these differences between characters and their investments and their identities would also be clear in that way. But I think once students can sort of hear the play, I do think it really allows students or sort of forces us to think about that language itself affords its own pleasures, right? So, a story is not, a plot can be a source of pleasure and a source of interest, but actually just language itself. Characters just love to talk and they get pleasure from talking themselves. They get pleasure from hearing other characters talk. They get pleasure from characters speaking not so well, right? In ways that, differentiate class. So although it's a hard sell, I do think that if and when I can convince students that language itself can be pleasurable, I think that helps students understand why the play might be worth our attention. In addition to all the issues of race and class and gender, that we can really think about language as something that really defines who we are and something that we can just enjoy. And language itself is part of the entertainment of the play.
Absolutely. And I mean, just thinking of the various ways in which Shakespeare can be sort of activated, as it were, by these oral and performative qualities, I think it's a very helpful technique to, especially with this play. And as one of my colleagues pointed out, they said, The Merry Wives of Windsor isn't actually that boring. It's filled with a lot of physical humor, but on the page, as you see it represented, it is a lot of talking, a lot of punning, a lot of joking. Definitely a work that I think shares with Love's Labour's Lost this sort of pleasure with language and this investigative attitude towards it.
Yes, right. I think it also helps make the point that we ought to be thinking about performance while we're reading, and it's not that we don't read Shakespeare, and people have not read Shakespeare, and derive pleasure solely from the reading of Shakespeare. I don't want to discount that, and I do try to say that that is valid in and of itself. But at the same time, when we're thinking about bodies on stage and characters with different voices and listening, right, that sometimes with particular plays, I think this play in particular, it comes, it's much more intelligible. It makes more sense. It's much more enjoyable. Than reading. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but I believe it is. I find a play less fun to read than I find other plays, right? This play is much more fun when we're listening to it or when we're watching it on stage.
I think that's a pretty fair estimation, but notwithstanding, even with that qualification, it definitely still, as you aver, it's a fascinating and fun work.
Yeah.
Maybe that's actually a very interesting sort of segue that we can consider, because I would almost characterize Love's Labour's Lost as a play sort of preoccupied by rhetorical excess.
Mhm.
You have this sort of pedantic school teacher, Holofernes, who has this whole diatribe on the death of a deer. Don Adriano de Armado, who's just this sort of effusive Spanish courtier who's very sort of grandiloquent. But then also our main characters, this sort of tetralogy of male figures and female figures as they woo, spurn one another, and so on. So um, maybe I was wondering, could you comment generally on your approach, maybe even to teaching or just thinking through this play's approach to language as performance, and kind of where that facade cracks? That is where we maybe as students and readers can kind of have insight into a number of themes. Of course, you've indexed race, which is a very important one.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I see in this play, of course, not only in this play, but one of the things that Kim Hall says in Things of Darkness, and when in doubt, read Kim Hall and quote Kim Hall, is that language itself creates difference, right? I think like this is a play where that is so like so true on so many different levels. First on the level as performance, right? Characters who perform, right? Speaking in a different ways, some successful, some to praise, some less successfully and to be ridiculed. Like, so for Don Armado, for example, right? Although he takes a lot of pleasure in the way he speaks, he is there mostly, he's being laughed at by the gentlemen of Navarre, right? He's there for their entertainment, but not in the way in which Barone performs speaking, also for entertainment, but his entertainment, the entertainment that he performs gets celebrated. It becomes a sign of his wit, versus Don Armado's performances are associated with his Spanishness, his foreignness, his an excess, right? That's an inflated sense of his character, inflated sense of its own worth. So even though they're both performers of rhetoric, and both are excessive, like both excessive too in the way they speak, one type of excess is deemed poetic. It's spoken in prose. I'm sorry, spoken in case of Don. Sorry, in the case of Barone, right, spoken in blank verse. In the case of Don Armado, spoken in prose, and becomes a source of our laughter.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Costard, the sort of rustic character, the malapropistic rustic, who he hears Holofernes speaking in Latin. He hears him say, "I scarcely believe, haud credo." And he goes, "No, they didn't shoot an old gray doe."
Yes, yeah.
So I would agree with you that I think there are ways in which sort of language as performance facade slips, and how that itself can be a great source of pleasure. You sort of spoke a little bit about Biron as a protagonist character, and I figured he's a very interesting one to think through the question of race. After all, you also called out Don Adriano's Spanishness.
Mm-hmm.
There are multiple ways in which we can read sort of racial constitution. This work shares with, for example, the Sea Voyage that I interviewed Professor Hilary Eklund about, the fact that no English characters are actually being staged here. Um, so I think it's very interesting to think through this as a vector. And you had me read your chapter on Venus and Adonis, featured in the Oxford Handbook on Shakespeare and Race. And you made an argument there that in many ways, when we read Venus and Adonis, we're reading the concept of racial whiteness as it relates to abstinence. And I find that that's actually an extremely compelling optic to read through Love's Labour's Lost. After all, it's a play predicated upon the idea that these four Navarrese noblemen say, we're going to sequester ourselves from the company of women, we're going to be abstinent and chaste, we're just going to devote ourselves to study for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And anyone who sort of flouts this vow on pain of, well, to be determined by the sort of council, the group, but it's also a work that's interested in the kind of, as it were, policing of whiteness and sort of the protection of sexual abstinence. I was wondering, could you maybe reflect generally, what we might draw from this as readers, teachers, students? What are your commentaries?
Yeah, I think Well, I think this is not at all original to sort of think about the way in which race and sexuality are very, closely linked, right? There's a lot of scholarship on that. But I do think, right, one of the things I'm interested in the Venus and Adonis essays, particularly poetic tropes and poetic language. So we're in a poetic tradition that equates chastity and virginity with whiteness, and promiscuity and sex generally, and sexuality with darkness. Like, how how do white people reproduce themselves, right? On the one hand, right, at least within the sort of poetic idiom, right? But I sort of see that these plays are sort of really trying to figure that out. That there's this desire for um, these white characters to sort of be white in every way possible, right? And sort of like completely divorce themselves from anything that is associated with darkness. And of course, with that, there has to be this rejection of sexuality.
Hmm.
And of course, I think in this play, right, there is a sort of question around Rosalind's sexuality later in the play with the moment of stickomythic dialogue with Catherine. Right, this that light, dark, or is she light? Is she dark? Right, the question of what is Rosalind's sexual constitution? Is she a light woman, right? Is she a dark woman, right? And all the various permutations of those words and connotations of those words really comes up, right? So the sort of contrasting of this male world where we just need to leave all of that behind, because at the moment you introduce women into the play, you've also introduced darkness. You've introduced the possibility of sex, which is seen as a distraction from this homosocial, insulated world where men can just be, men. They can also just devote themselves to a life of the mind. They can also sort of sequester themselves from the world outside, right? Because also in that world is all the, all the various allusions to class, um, and um, and race and ethnicity, right? So there is this sort of fantasy of a retreat from that world, a world that is sort of completely divorced from that, even though, right, it doesn't take very long for that world to um, enter into and make that type of retreat into all male abstinence, austerity, purity, whiteness, a life of the mind, rather that has almost nothing to do with the body, right? Because somehow they only sleep three hours a night, and yet they study all day. Like, that's just not possible. But that seems to be the fantasy that the play wants to imagine, even though it shows that it's an impossibility.
Absolutely. I mean, I would even go so far as to say that Shakespeare kind of satirizes that with a quick turn. The king has made these pronouncements. They're also going to sleep in sparse conditions for only 3 hours. Food is very limited. It's pretty much wake up, study, study, study. But then I think it's Biron who interjects within the first, I think, 100 lines of the play and says, "My king, the Princess of France is coming here for an embassy. Don't you
Yes.
think you're going to have to sort of drop this tenet of the company of women is forbidden?" To which he replies, yes, okay, well, we're going to have to throw away that dictate, which I think fundamentally undermines the principle of the project and forces readers as well as sort of the characters within the play to confront all of the various ways in which these sort of co-constituting categories you're alluding to,
Mm-hmm.
broadly light and darkness, light as enlightenment of knowledge, light as also racial, because um, the rejection of the company of the women is also in many ways a rejection of sort of political solidarity between
Mm-hmm.
France and Bar. So I would agree there are absolutely many stakes to the idea that this sort of self-imposed chastity of the Navarrese nobleman is also very intimately linked with concepts of race, concepts of gender, all of these various things that the sort of entrance of the French women to the court sort of contions them to consider.
Yes, right. I think it also, right, it allows in the classroom, particularly the way to think, the way in which sex becomes, of course, sex is about sex, and of course, the play is full of double entendres, and students love those, right? With, you know, they're like, oh my God, this play is filthy in some places, right? If they get the jokes. But the way in which sex becomes, you know, is so often is a metaphor, right? For other types of intercourse, right? So, of, so the allusions to Spain, right? And then the fact that the noblemen come disguised as Muscovites, and one can then talk about the English involvement with the Muscovy Company, right? So the larger sort of questions around insularity versus engagement with a larger colonial project and the world, like all of these become sort of accessible through just sort of thinking about the relationship between abstinence and sex in the play. Yeah, stay by myself or not stay by myself, right? Works on a variety of levels in the play.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to sort of further corroborate the need to more critically investigate race, we're given that stage direction when they're having this sort of Muscovite play at the end, enter blackamoors with music. So I think there are many ways in which confronting this play on the stage as well as on the page, it invites us to consider all of these issues as being very much intersectional and interwoven. They are not separate.
Yeah, and I think this whole question around performance in particular, right? One of the questions that I sort of ask students, in the class is well, first of all, is Rosalind Black? Why does that matter? If she is, why would it matter? How does that change our understanding of what is said about her? Right. I think, one of the questions is, we see Rosalind, the audience sees Rosalind. We don't know exactly what the audience in the late 16th century saw, right? Except for the fact that it would have been a boy actor wearing cosmetics of some sort, whether they are white pancake or whether it's blackface or black up. We don't know for sure, but but if we sort of imagine or see Rosalind one way, or Rosaline one way, what does that do for our understanding of the play and the sort of working of race and language and poetry versus if we see her another way, or she's being presented another way? And then also could, it makes possible of thinking about, like, if you were putting on the play today, what do you do, right? There's a whole question, I think, in some contemporary productions, of course, a lot of that anti-Black language that happens between, the nobleman gets excised. But if you leave it there, right, what does the race of the actor playing Rosaline, what does it do? Why does it matter? What different effects might it have for the audience's understanding of what's at stake? Yeah. So students,
Absolutely.
I think the students like that question. I think it becomes a challenging one because you can sort of see that, there's no correct way, right, to answer that question. But there are different stakes depending on who is the body of the actor performing that role today, and then thinking about how cosmetics might have been alluding to a particular type of racialized body in the period in which the play was originally performed.
And I think even in just the way in which you scaffold this matter, sort of took it from page to stage, you thought about modern adaptation as well as reception within the early modern period. I think you very eloquently scaffolded the need to be able to approach concepts like race and gender, all of these issues, which are very much pertinent to reading the Shakespearean texts or early modern texts in general. And I think you have just made a very eloquent case for the need to do it and the need to do it well, because students also enjoy being challenged. The avoidance of talking about these things is in no way ameliorating. And so I find your approach to be very reasoned, but also convincing. And I mean, it's stimulating me.
Thank you.
Well, unless there's any other sort of question or comment you had, I think that we've spent a significant amount of time thinking through Love's Labor's Lost together. I wanted to thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Diego. I've enjoyed this conversation, and Hopefully it'll inspire a couple more people to teach it. Maybe everyone's teaching it and I just don't know, but it'll be interesting to maybe have conversation with other colleagues about how often this play is getting taught in classes and what types of conversation students are engaged in. But I have found it a productive play to bring into the classroom, and hopefully others will too.
Well, I can say that when I'm constructing my future syllabi, it will absolutely be on my mind.
All right.
All right. Thank you for your time, and I hope you have a nice day.
Thank you. You too.